Um, Hi, everyone. So I want to thank the Asia Society, Rachel Cooper, Marina Chan, and David and Bart, of course, and the audience also. I wish you all a Happy New Year. We might as well just jump right into it if it's okay with you. It's perhaps auspicious that our conversation is taking place today, the first day of the new Lunar New Year, not the day of that speech. So as the new year, it's set to mark the imminent return of spring, and given the weather, I think it was actually sort of interesting. So the advertised topic of our discussion tonight is the politics of representation in mainstream theater, and of Asians and Asian Americans more specifically. A recent study that was published by the Asian American Performers Action Coalition noted that in the 10 years from 2006 to 2016, Asian American performers on Broadway constituted just 3.7% of all performers. And it's really only even that high, I think, thanks to one or both of these two people. So thank you for that. Okay. So the issue of casting, be it colorblind or otherwise, is really important, especially in our sort of post-Hamilton moment. And of course, just getting Asian or Asian American bodies on stage and getting those bodies paid is certainly an important topic for discussion. But I'd actually like to start by thinking about what those Asian American or Asian bodies on stage can do once they're up there. That is, what are the effects that are generated by them? Because as we all know, and I say this as someone who is resolutely not comfortable on stage, they actually had to explain to me what stage left was. These effects extend far beyond the stage and beyond the theater doors. So actually, Asian Americans have been performing on American stages since the 19th century, believe it or not, and they have been portrayed on those stages in yellowface and other ways for at least as long. And we could have a long conversation about that history and its continued popularity, but tonight we're actually lucky enough to have two American theater artists who are arguably two of the most influential figures to have engaged with this question, the question of the politics of representation in recent years. So I'd like to just turn to them and get them talking. The immediate inspiration for tonight's conversation is David's current project, Soft Power, and its relationship to Bart's celebrated 2015 revival of The King and I. But both of these people have worked extensively and thought really deeply about questions of representation, both in terms of race and ethnicity, gender and sexuality, and many other kind of points of identity for a long time. And so I hope our conversation will include that longer trajectory of both of their careers. But I wanted to just to get us started, David, could you maybe say a little bit about Soft Power, its genesis, its inspiration? I think some people may be familiar with the work, but a lot of people aren't. So maybe just talk us through.
Yeah, thanks, Karen. And thank you all for coming. It's a little complicated to talk about Soft Power really in New York, since maybe there's like 5 or 6 of you who've seen it in the house and 3 or 4 of you who were in it. And I think maybe one person who co-wrote it with me is in the house. Nice. And I'm also not allowed to say when it's coming to New York, so it's all very theoretical at this point.
We won't tell.
But it's fair to say that we do expect the show to come to New York quite soon. Great. So I'll try to describe the show, and then also I'll talk about the origins. And there's sort of a PowerPoint thing where theoretically there's some pictures, and we'll see. Okay, so it's a play that becomes a musical. So I wanted to explore the notion of whether you can begin an evening of theater with a play and then all of a sudden have it turn into a musical and have the two parts inform each other and hopefully create a coherent evening. So the first 20 or 30 minutes, depending on how the rewrites go, is the play. And it's a comedy that's set in 2016 in America. And then the show jumps 100 years into the future. And the incident that we saw in 2016 has since been mythologized and become the source material for a beloved East-West musical in China. So the conceit is that for the rest of the show, we're watching a Chinese musical, which was written 50 years in the future, about 2016, and which celebrates, from a Chinese point of view, how China stepped in to lead the world when America collapsed after the 2016 election. And so the inspiration for the show was, in fact, I mean, there's kind of a couple antecedents for it, but certainly one of them is seeing Bart's production of The King and I. And The King and I is a show that I've always loved. And I think I saw the production. It's like a gorgeous production. There's not a lot to argue with and in terms of how beautifully it was rendered. And I also became more aware now at this point, seeing the show, of some things that felt kind of questionable to me. And we can get into that. But by the end of the show, again, it's so beautifully done, both in terms of the way it was written and the way it was staged, that by the end, the king is dying, I'm in tears, and it totally works for me on that level. So it's a sort of complicated question of when we are watching shows or movies or dealing with works of art which are beautifully crafted and incredibly artistic, and there's stuff that feels questionable or even untrue in the source material itself. And that contradictory emotion or set of emotions that it calls up, I think, in a lot of people nowadays with a lot of different types of work. So I'll just kind of go through this. This is, so I originally set out to write kind of a reverse King and I. And so you have Conrad Ricamora in the middle there, who's playing a Chinese film executive who comes to America, and this is a sort of landing scene at LAX. And then, what else? Oh, he has a romance with a important American political figure, which I think I probably am not going to name, but you might be able to infer what I was going for. And then some of you might play Yellowface, and there's an autobiographical character, DHH, and DHH also appears in this show, and here he's played by Francis Jew. And I should mention that in the previous photo, Elise Allen Lewis plays the important American political figure. And Conrad, there's a sort of plot that involves his daughter, and that he's going away, and sort of his duty to family. So he's about to get on the plane to come to America. This is a scene that takes place at a campaign rally in a McDonald's. And again, the notion being that these future Chinese authors did a certain amount of research, but not that much research. So they were trying to set the campaign rally in a famous American restaurant, and they came up with McDonald's. And this is a scene that takes place in the White House with Ray Lee singing a song called Good Guy with a Gun. And Conrad is dealing with his being torn between his sense of duty and the sort of romance that seems to be budding in America. Oh, and then DHH at a certain point, some of you may know that I got stabbed in the neck about 3 years ago and had an artery severed, and somehow it got into the show. And there's me being, and then we also go into, so part of it is an anti-democracy musical, because from a Chinese point of view, trying to use the delivery system of the musical to kind of impart a Chinese, more sort of authoritarian, technocratic point of view. It involves a sort of, the democracy and voting is sort of portrayed in an everything's up to date in Kansas City sort of way. Oh, and here we are back at McDonald's. Oh, and there's a panel, which is probably, it's too hard to explain right now, so I'm not going to go into that. And this is the finale for the song called Democracy, and that's Age of Society. So that gives you a basic sense of what the show's about.
I do want to say that DHH, I went to high school with Frances Jew, who was playing DHH. I know it seems so weird, and Conrad Rickmore was the lead Lunta in King and I. So there's sort of this weird small world of the American musical theater that they sort of all intersect. But anyway, there we are.
So thank you for that, David. So I actually wanted to turn to Bart now. So now we all kind of have an understanding of that. It's a great title and a concept, soft power, because as we know, Joseph and I's sort of celebrated phrase, soft power is, musicals are a tremendously evocative and effective form of soft power that is conveying a certain kind of cultural set of values, often associated with a particular kind of national ideology or whatever. And as Rachel mentioned, American musicals are just such a really potent kind of soft power, especially Rodgers and Hammerstein, but certainly all of them. So Bart, in addition to your wider repertoire of directing projects, I know you don't only do musicals, but you have earned a reputation for doing musical revivals in a way that are really interesting and self-reflexive and self-reflexive and self-aware about their sort of revivalness, right? Their status as revival. I read in an interview that you said a revival must always ask the question, why now? When you decide to stage one. So I'm curious, can you say more about that and maybe how you answered that question when you turned to The King and I in 2015?
Yeah, one distinction I always make is the difference between the interpretive artist and the creative artist. So I'm an interpretive artist, so I need this pre-existing reality, a text, to kind of work. Whereas the creative artist, and it's a job I think is much harder than mine, has to come up with this story out of the mist and create something. So, so one of the principles I have when it comes to doing a revival is to ask, the first question is always, what is its immediate significance now? Why must we do it now? What is the purpose of doing it? In the case of King and I was drawn to the struggle between tradition and modernity in cultures. So that even in contemporary cultures in anywhere in the world, the struggle between traditional ways and how modernity is pushing in on them is kind of central. So for me in The King and I, there's a scene where the king has a discussion with his son about what Anna is teaching them, and the son is appalled because she said that she tells them that the sun, the earth goes around the sun, and he knows that their myths tell them something else. And the king says, well, she's right. And his son's head explodes. And it's this struggle of a king who's facing colonialism and all these things in 1862. And I focused very deeply on that struggle. Assume for myself finding whatever resonances there were for cultures currently, whether it would be an extremely conservative Islamic culture, which in which women were covered from head to foot. How would I feel about that versus in a modern world? Not judging it, because it's not. I don't have to judge, but I thought so. I spent a good deal of my time on King and I pushing through those things. The other thing about King and I is, I think it's very clear that, while I would give Rodgers and Hammerstein lots of credit for being experimental and innovative artists in the same way Janine and David are experimental and innovative today by pushing into stories we don't normally have, they still were the product of their time and had assumptions which now we know don't make sense in the same way. So some of the work on King and I was sort of stripping it of this sort of decorative qualities that it had grown sort of over the piece over time.
Actually, I'd like to hear about that from both of you. I think tonight we were focused specifically on musicals and that dressing up that happens, both literal and kind of emotional, that's kind of specific to the form of musical. So when you say you were stripping away, I guess could you maybe say a little bit more about what you did?
Yeah, I mean, if anyone's seen the film of The King and I, they're wearing like Scottish plaids, and like the clothes are completely mad and weird, and and also the ways they would portray even just the physical world of the temple and the behavior within the temple, and did a lot of research into Thai, not just Thai culture, but Thai behavior, meaning like how you behave around the king, even today versus, so that you try to get inside of the actual thing rather than the world that they invented in 1952. And they had a cast of 70 in the original production. I think 2 people were Asian in the original cast. So that's kind of insane when you think about it. But I'm sure it didn't occur to anybody that that was good or bad, but that's still not good. So there's just different ways in which some of it was surface, some of it was text, restoring text, looking at text again, some of it was recontextualizing songs, looking at what the opening is, how the ballet functions within the piece. There's a lot of weird sections at the end where they do a dance of an elephant king that's very strange. We rethought that, stuff like that.
And David, I guess I'm curious about your choice to use the device of a musical on the inside of a play, and what you felt needed to be amped up in the section where it turns to musical.
I mean, I guess I'm interested in kind of the tropes that I grew up with, particularly as they relate to East-West stories. And I was just telling my collaborators the other day, because we're still working on rewriting and reworking the show, that one thing I've learned about myself from having worked on this show is that people often ask, I was born and raised in LA, and did you experience racism as a kid? And I don't remember a lot of specific racist incidents, but I do remember that if I knew that there was going to be like a TV show or a movie or something with Asian characters, I would go out of my way not to watch it. Because there was something in me as a kid that registered the fact that I would end up feeling bad if I watched this. And so I think that I realized so far from working on the show that if anything, I felt kind of oppressed by American popular culture when I was growing up. And that a lot of my adult life has therefore been about trying to gain access to, to sort of the levers of culture and storytelling, and then, rework them for my own purposes. So, and Butterfly is obviously a riff to some extent on Madame Butterfly. And in terms of, these sorts of the tropes that I'm working on in soft power, it's this notion of, you have a sort of white character who goes into an exotic culture, and it's a little scary, and they sort of bring a sort of enlightenment or to the native culture. There's usually kind of a love story, which doesn't end up lasting, and then they go home, and they're sadder but wiser, having had this encounter with this foreign culture. And, so those are the kind of tropes that I feel are pretty consistent through the retelling, through various iterations of telling the East-West story through a Western lens. And I think a lot of that is what I'm trying to see. Well, how does it feel when we reverse that in soft power?
I mean, I guess, I'm going to take my questions out of order, but it seems like we're in a moment when a lot of these questions of identity and representation are particularly, I think, at the front of mind for a lot of people, but also really fraught and complicated. The claim to identity by different kinds of groups, new groups staking claims on the basis of identity. I guess one of my questions for both of you, and here we don't have to just talk about The King and I and soft power, but both of you have worked, along a lot of these, been working a lot of these questions in other musicals that you've worked on. Do you feel like the genre of the musical allows you, are there particular minefields or challenges in taking up these, what could be potentially very hot button political issues in the form of musical? Like, is there something about singing that makes it either more dangerous or safer to kind of take some of these questions on? Do you even think about that?
Okay, I think there are different levels of, in terms of the different kinds of dramatic forms. To what extent do they try to imitate reality? Yeah. So certainly, I think most of the time the way we do movies, for instance, in America, we are creating a kind of realistic aesthetic. So even if it's Star Wars, it's like, okay, this is actually happening. And then when you go to plays, there are obviously many different kinds of plays, but plays are, I think, inherently abstracted from reality because they are necessarily metaphorical. Like, even if it's a naturalistic drama and it's a kitchen sink, you know that's not a real kitchen sink. So there's already a level of metaphor. Then when you get to musicals, okay, the idea that people burst into song is not something that we're very used to in real life. So there's that, there's another level of abstraction. Then you can say opera, is beyond that. And so I guess musicals, therefore, number one, are really hard to make work. So no matter what the content is, if the creators can get a musical to fire on all these pistons and that all these elements are actually working together, that's an impressive craft achievement. But if you can do that, then I do feel that, this term that Jeanine Tesori uses that I've sort of appropriated for soft power, which is the delivery system, that the musical system, that the musical, when it's working, allows you to kind of deliver ideas like directly to the heart. And kind of, I wouldn't say bypass the intellect, but you can kind of get really quick past the intellect. And that makes musicals both more powerful and I guess potentially more dangerous.
Yeah, I mean, musicals are an emotional art form. My response to that, I can make a historical response to it because the musical in, say, the 50s when something like South Pacific was happening, it was a very large innovation on the part of Rodgers and Hammerstein in Oklahoma to have a character die. Okay? And if you trace R&H in the ways in which they were innovating, to take on something like the stress between, Siam and the white lady from England and put that into a musical was very unusual, and push through their career how they were innovative. Then you go another step ahead to, say, Sondheim, who was very influenced by Hammerstein, and he pushed it to whole other places. And now with Jeanine Tesori, who I think is arguably one of our very, very greatest composers in the musicals today, with Fun Home or with Soft Power, is pushing it to completely new places and seeing where song operates to express what you can't express in speech. So I always compare them a little bit to Shakespeare, because in Shakespeare you're always roving between the prose and the poetry, and when it lifts into poetry, it's a heightened character, a heightened situation. Well, in musicals, and when you're putting together new musicals, it's always ramping into when it's a song, or what is the song, or how is it different. And the minute it becomes a song, from a directorial point of view, it becomes deeply abstracted, because it may have repetition, it may have all these other things to it. So it's well suited. When I hear that, I haven't seen Soft Power, but when I hear the story of it, it seems incredibly well suited to a change of time, space, expression, and I think people are thirsting. You can tell they're thirsting for different kinds of ways of taking in information, and musicals can push you to that. So.
Actually, I just realized, do you want to say a little bit about South Pacific, for people that maybe didn't get a chance to say some of the...
It was good, I think.
Well, some of the choices that you made.
South Pacific's a different case, because in the case of South Pacific, their experimentation there was, the question there is who gets to be in your family. So when we were doing South Pacific, at that point it was miscegenation, and the girl from Arkansas, and he has kids, or mixed race, and whether they can be, and it was explosive, and it was Democrats, and talking about race was a huge thing in musicals, and was profound. By the time we got to it in 2008, it was all about gay marriage for us as a subtext. Like who gets to be in our families, plus other things that it expresses about who we are in terms of our development of our ideas about race. But you can do that in the subtext. And also that was another one which had become a story which had all been about, you know, the follies and, you know, dressing up as girls in hula skirts and weird things like that that had to be wiped away from that show. And the representation of, and most of their understanding of race in that show was completely wrong. You know, so the casting, the original casting was Juanita Hall, who is, you know, African American playing Bloody Mary, who's actually from Hanoi, while the kids who were, you know, supposedly mixed race were Asian, but actually they would have been more Aboriginal. I mean, there's a whole weird mix of the whole thing. So you had to kind of reinvestigate all of that.
Yeah. Actually, I just realized, David, we've been talking about your respective roles as a creator of original work and an interpreter as a director, but Flower Drum Song, you actually did do some original work, right? And so it's this weird hybrid of a revival and an
Yeah, so Flower
piece.
Drum Song sort of fell into what we now call the revisical category, which is, you know, which long preceded my Flower Drum Song. The notion that, and this actually speaks to the difficulty of creating musicals, because there are a number of older musicals where people feel, oh, we love those songs, but the musical doesn't quite work. And you know, the fault usually gets laid at the feet of the book or script, which is probably right. But anyway, there have been various attempts to create revisicals.
No, that is right.
Okay.
It's always the book's fault.
Right, and when it works, you don't really notice.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. When it works, you never know. The book writer never gets any credit, actually, but if it's not working, they get all the blame.
Right. That's why I made myself into a character on this one.
Yeah.
So anyway, so yeah, Flower Drum Song, I think, was a show that, as a kid, it sort of was the exception in the sense that I liked it as a kid. I mean, I didn't grow up in New York, so I never saw it on stage, but I did catch it, you know, one night on late night TV or whatever, and there was, you know, these sort of amazing Asian American performers sort of singing and dancing, and then Flower Drum Song was, you know, Rodgers and Hammerstein called it their lucky hit, and it was a hit in its time, and then it sort of fell off the face of the earth, and it wasn't really getting done anymore, and it is the only, up until Allegiance in 2015, I guess, it was the only musical that had ever been written in American theatrical history about Asian Americans, as opposed to Asians in Asia. But when it comes to Asian Americans, Flower Drum Song was it. And so it seems sad to me that these songs and this show had been lost. And yeah, in college, I started to go, oh wow, there's stuff that's really questionable in the script. But there's some great stuff too, you know, and it is a situation where Rodgers and Hammerstein chose to cast a virtually, not a completely all-Asian cast, but almost an all-Asian cast for the Broadway debut in 1958, which was a hard thing to do in those days. And so you have to give them credit for that. And so I approached the Rodgers and Hammerstein estate and said, was there a way for me to do a revisical of Flower Drum Song? And Ted Chapin, Mary Rodgers were incredibly supportive. And honestly, I think it had something to do with the fact that nobody was doing Flower Drum Song anymore, so why not take a chance on it? It's not like I was asking to rewrite Oklahoma. But that was an experience of trying to just kind of switch the lens a little and make it, there's a lyric in Flower Drum Song, Grant Avenue, you travel there in a trolley, up you climb. Up you go, down, you're in Hong Kong, up you, whatever. Anyway, the point is, so that lyric is really sort of from a tourist point of view, because who's the you there? You travel there in a trolley. You are the tourist. And so I guess I tried to do a version that felt more like from the inside of the community out.
Mm-hmm. And actually, can you just, for the people who didn't see it, talk about like some of the other specific things that you did?
So the original story is basically a love quadrangle between Hwang, who's the son of Master Hwang, and these 3 women. And I took a little bit from the original musical and some of the characters. So, Rodgers and Hammerstein and Joseph Fields reset it there was a nightclub, and a character named Linda Lowe, who was sort of a nightclub performer based on the chop suey circuit from the 1950s and mostly 50s and early 60s. So I borrowed some of those characters and smushed some of them together and tried to create essentially a show about how a traditional Chinese opera becomes a Western-style nightclub as a sort of theatrical metaphor for assimilation. And that was my basic strategy.
That's great. I just watched it again at the Lincoln Center, the public library. I recommend it to everyone.
Thank you, Public Library.
Yeah, thank you guys. It's fabulous. Actually, you can go see all of these guys' work. It's fantastic. So I guess one question I have, I think again, in another interview that you gave, I read you described working in a revolutionary time. I think you had the reference specifically to post-Hamilton. In terms of race and identity and casting and those sorts of questions. You spoke to the need to engage in creative arts. So I'm interested, I guess, in what you were saying in terms of the need to engage in the creative arts to imagine maybe possible futures that, and that need, I think, was never more urgent than now. But I'm sort of curious about your respective positions on engaging directly with political questions. I think in one interview, Bart, I think you said you were maybe not, you said you didn't want to give too much, essentially not to give too much oxygen to certain political figures or political questions.
Yeah, I mean, I think I meant the current.
Yes, I think you did.
The current leadership.
I didn't want to out you.
Yeah, no, one time I worked with Pedro Almodovar, who is a great Spanish filmmaker, and we were doing Women on the Verge of a Nervous Breakdown. And he is, what's beautiful about his work is there's, in the subtext, it's all political. We always talk about political with a small p, not a capital P. And we, at one point when we were developing the musical, had the name of Franco in the story. And he never gave us a note ever. He said, except you can't use his name. And we asked, well, why? And he said, because we don't talk about him. And throughout his whole career, everything about Women on the Verge is about him on some level. It's about a different way of thinking and being. And he was, a young gay man growing up in Spain at the time, and how revolutionary all their work was. But he said, the only way to deal with that is not to talk about that person, because it gives them oxygen. So we won't talk about anything happening tonight at all. And I think that the responsibility that we always all feel, and David's work's been like this ever since he started writing, is at some level you're always addressing questions with a small p of the politics of your time, whether it's in a revival or you're working on something new, because you have to be responsible about representation, about who we are, about the stories we tell, whether from a historical point of view or a contemporary point of view. That's always in the work. Now, I don't think we should. Now, it's different from making statements or doing something like that. I don't think that's what we do. We pose better questions, we create contradictions, we push things together you don't expect, and then people have to deal with it. But something like Hamilton, I think, is a good example, because not only is it this thorough reimagining of the story of Alexander Hamilton, but the representation on stage is a completely huge rethinking of how we should cast or think about stuff. So they put it all the way through the piece.
David, what's your take?
Yeah, and I agree that I'm interested in asking questions more than making statements, because I feel like if I know what the answer to a question is, I don't need to write the play. I can just write an op-ed piece or something. So yes, questions are more important to me. I don't quite know how to parse small p versus capital P, because I feel like since the beginning of my career, I've always been interested in engaging explicitly political questions. However, I do agree that it's important to kind of abstract it a little. So even in soft power, yes, we're talking about the events of 2016, but we're trying to filter them through theoretically a historical lens. So we're theoretically looking back on these events from 50 years in the future and another country. And we also don't name the current president because, we did the same way that the king or the Kralahome doesn't get named. He's just the president.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, I didn't think about that. Actually, I didn't even think about that connection, so thank you. I guess, it strikes me as one of the differences or just variance between your two perspectives is, the thing that we're trying to wrestle with, I think, are kind of point of view, right? Minoritarian point of view, like who is looking and from what point of view are you invited into the story? And I think the King and I and soft power are really all about point of view in some ways, right? About how who you are kind of defines what you see, right? How you experience this exotic place, right? So I guess I'm sort of curious about how you, as artists, your point of view, your life experiences, your professional and personal experiences, how do you feel like do those things come into the kinds of aesthetic choices you make? How do you balance those? Are you conscious of them and the choices you're making?
Me go first. Yeah. Well, I as the interpretive artist, the point of view is often dictated. To some degree, it's dictated. If it's Chekhov that I'm doing, or if it's Verdi, or if it's, you're going to be entering something that has its own story beforehand. Sure. And so I think that the mechanism there is different. Now, I'm not as radical an interpretive artist as there are all over the world and here in New York. But I think that is the difference is that and also I'm part of the white male patriarchy. So my point of view might be important, but I think that the more important question I always have to ask, which is why I do small p versus capital P, is I don't do my interpretation of King and I based on the fact that I would see myself as a progressive Democrat, which I do, but I will be analyzing the thing from perhaps a humanistic perspective of what questions are on the table to see what lessons there might be for today, so that audiences can battle it out. I experienced this hugely having just done To Kill a Mockingbird, because it's this Rorschach test, hugely important American work against which everybody has a point of view. And so there it was trying to make something which, even though Aaron Sorkin was taking a point of view on it and we were developing it, what it meant today, but also how audiences could bring themselves to it to ask questions about what the story meant for them today. And some of that required me not to be between them and the story. So that's an interpretive problem, question, issue that I would have to kind of go through. So I have a different, I don't see, if I was the creative artist, I don't see how you can not have a very distinct point of view, and it comes from everything about who you are. I get at least to pretend that I'm as smart as Chekhov if I'm working with Chekhov when you come see it, but I'm not that. And that's an extraordinary, genius resonance thing that you get to kind of swirl around inside of.
Yeah, and I think, as Bart says, since I'm an author, I think it's not possible for me to do something which isn't based on my experience in one way or another. And in some ways, if sort of in terms of the body of my work, some of that is pretty obvious. But I find it interesting that. So in college, I got this idea that I could write plays. I saw some plays, and I was like, oh, maybe I can do this. And at the time, it didn't occur to me that I would end up writing about a lot of the subjects I've ended up, being my body of work. And I just wanted to be a playwright. And I didn't think of myself, I knew I was Asian American, but I didn't think it had any particular significance to myself. And then I had the privilege between my junior and senior year in college to study playwriting with Sam Shepard and Maria Irene Fornez. And they really kind of opened me up to writing more from my subconscious. And once I did that, I found that these issues started appearing on the page, things like clash of cultures and immigration and assimilation and all that stuff. So clearly some part of me was incredibly interested in these subjects, but my conscious mind hadn't figured that out yet. And so for me, there's a sort of reciprocal relationship between the artist and the work. Like the artist literally creates the work, but the work also recreates the artist. It like changes who you are if you're kind of trying to engage with it in a meaningful way.
Yeah. I guess, I think, David, you probably get a version of this question a lot, but I'm curious about it for both of you. To what extent do you feel obligated or, obligated to be a spokesperson in your work for a certain point of view, or does that start to hem you in, or?
No, I mean, I feel like I've gone back and forth on that a lot, and I've been fortunate to have a long career, and so in 1980, there just weren't, it's not like I was the first Asian American playwright, but there weren't that many. And so I also then came out of sort of political point of view. Like once I started writing about Asian American stuff, and I started kind of studying kind of nascent Asian American studies, and then we were all kind of Maoists in those days because no one figured out that the Cultural Revolution was a bad thing. And so, so I sort of came out of a fairly radical point of view. And so that kind of affected how I began to think of myself. And then I went through periods when I was like, no, I don't want to be an Asian American writer. And at this point, I've gotten to work on some stories that are Asian American and some stories that aren't. And, but I do find myself going back to this well when I have my own kind of personal projects to do. So clearly, even 40 years after having worked with Sam and Irene, this is still the sort of subconscious soil that seems to be most fertile for me creatively.
I mean, and he won't say this, but while in the last 10 years, the issue of identity and writing and representation have become so big, we are old enough that we've been asking these questions a long time, but particularly David is one of the most profound, and he's been blazing a trail and asking these questions for a very, very long time, and very powerfully all the way along. So,
yeah, thank you. And actually, I just wanted to, as an aside, I think there is going to be an opportunity for Q&A. I'm not sure people are writing their questions down. Is there?
They're not digitally just putting them.
Right, don't tweet them. Yeah. So I have a couple more questions, but we're going to collect the questions at some point, and so I'm sure I've missed a lot of things. So please have questions ready for us. So I think we seem to be poised once again, apropos of your last comment, Bart. I think we're poised once again at a moment. It's a perpetual once again. At a moment of sort of dawning awareness of the imperative and I would say the value of diversity in theatrical representation. And I think, or at least I hope, that that's coupled with a growing understanding that diversity is nothing without kind of more substantive practices of actual inclusion. That is, it's not just the number of bodies on stage, although the number is important, but actually what those bodies do once they get up on stage and how they are allowed to speak and act. So the substantive practices of inclusion and a sort of ethos of equality, again, both in representation but also in employment practices. So with respect to the question of representation, either numerical or substantive, I guess for both of you, what do you think are the biggest challenges facing American theater right now? Or in your own, from your perspective, where are we going? Where should we be going? Where would you like us to go? And what's happening?
You go first this time.
Okay, so I want to make a distinction, first of all, between American dramatic forms and American theater.
Okay.
Because I would say that in general, the thing that feels paradigm shifting to me in American entertainment right now is the increasing notion that diversity, inclusion, a wide range of bodies and a wide range of stories is a good business model. If you consider the fact that this will be a majority people of color country by maybe 2040, than if you're only telling this, and if you assume that people like to see themselves on stages and screens, then being monolithic is simply not good for business. And you sort of see this happening on TV and in movies and in Star Wars, and the sort of big success of Black Panther, Crazy Rich Asians, is sort of assigned to Hollywood, which tends to run on fear that this is the direction you should go in. So where it comes to theater, it seems to me that that model applies too, but I feel like theater is, particularly commercial theater, feels to me a little slower in responding, despite Hamilton. And if you look at those,
why do you think that is?
well, and if you look at those APAC figures, yeah, it's like 2 or 3% Asian. But if you just look at minorities in general, people of color in general, it's
like
averaged about 20 to 25% people of color over the past 10 to 12 years. And that's just not a good figure. And my theory is that theater realizes intellectually that it needs to diversify. But because the audience is older, whiter, and wealthier, the need doesn't feel as immediate. So it still seems a little more like a worthy goal than a necessary means for the field to survive. That's my personal theory.
Yeah. I mean, I do think having grown up in the regional theater in America, that the regional theater has been struggling with these questions more and long before other forms of entertainment have. There's always been grants and people asking questions and people having long conversations about casting and about job hiring well ahead of most of that. I do agree when it comes to the commercial theater, because as soon as it goes from a nonprofit activity into a for-profit activity, then all the rules begin to shift a bit. And so that is slowly changing and is always sort of up for grabs. Other questions, about where do the writers come from, what are the casting practices, I think those are questions that are being asked all the time, whether it's through granting means, through different groups that start up or what have you. They're always under examination. But things like Crazy Rich Asians or Black Panther have a big impact if they're commercially successful on having a better impact working backwards. So I don't, that's still going to take time, but it's miles ahead of where it was.
Do you feel like those questions are being asked about the writers, the material, and the casting? Are they being asked differently or more urgently right now, or?
I think they're being asked more urgently because they are now related to a business model.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I do think. I don't think there's any way you can cast a show now without asking those questions. I mean, I don't think you could have done that for the last 25 years if you worked in the regional theater. People have been at least making strong efforts at that. But I think it's impossible not to have those questions. Now I have to expand that now into questions of gender and questions of sexuality and all kinds of other things that are beginning to also come into that. And they're also important to keep asking.
Yes. Yeah. I'm actually just curious, since both of you have taken shows outside of New York and all over the world, do these questions come up differently in different places?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, well, like in China, there's not, people are not particularly sensitive to, yellow-face casting, because why would they really? They're the majority, and so, but, they're super sensitive about other things. They're like super sensitive about Tibet. So, it's just like, who's sensitive about what in what environment? And I'm assuming you've had this experience of like you take a show to a foreign market, and it's kind of fascinating as an empirical example of how cultures are different. To just sit in the back of the house and listen to how the audience reacts and things that they laugh at, things they don't laugh at, things that they love or they feel cold to.
Yeah, I mean, yes, I agree.
Well, I was thinking this because when we spoke about the other night, you mentioned that King and I is going to Japan.
Yeah.
And I thought, that's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, that's going to be, and it's going to be in English.
Yeah.
with Japanese surtitles. I mean, that's a lot about Ken Watanabe. So, you know, they want to see him, and Kelly will be in it, and Ruthie M. Miles will be in it, and so we'll go and do it there. Now, what it's going to be like, now, where I'm interested in is that there are new markets opening up in India, so that same production is going to go to Mumbai and Delhi and like Bangalore. Wow. I think it'll be totally weird to watch it there.
Yeah.
See what they think.
It's
yeah.
I probably shouldn't say this because we're being videotaped, but when I was in Japan, I remember seeing in Théâtre du Soleil, one of their kind of chinoiserie pieces.
Oh yeah, what was
And I was really trying to eavesdrop on everybody to see what they thought of it, and they were not particularly troubled by it. They just didn't think it was very authentically done, right? They were like,
well, Théâtre du Soleil is a good example because in the '80s, where I like worshipped them, and they were like using katakali and using all these things,
right.
Everyone was just so that your mind was blown by them. And then they came back to the army recently, and everybody was furious.
Yes. Right.
Absolutely furious. How can they steal representation to all? And I was like, oh, I used to like them. You know, so it's we've changed.
Yeah.
And how those things happen has changed.
So, and how did you feel about that different kind of reaction?
I had friends in the show. It was hard, you know. I mean, I could understand. I could understand, and I could sense why there was upset about it. You know, I brought my kids to see it, and suddenly in the audience there was a whole different kind of reaction to certain forms of representation, and so that's fascinating. You know, she still had a huge impact on all of us when we were developing as artists. So it's kind of a complicated thing about how we change.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I don't know if people have had an opportunity. Oh, we have lots of questions. All right. So can I maybe?
Oh my God, questions.
Sorry?
Them into types.
Oh, she's already pre-curated them. Great.
Yes.
Yes.
So these are kind of, well, one big
There we go.
Should I turn this off? Yeah.
question has to do with specificity of ethnicity rather than a monolithic
Oh,
Asian.
okay. Yeah.
Talk amongst yourselves.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry. Actually, do you want to
Maybe
ask
I'll
him? Maybe you should just ask him. Yeah. Just trying to explain them to me.
It's really interesting because I do see that there are some thematics. So excuse me if I don't get your question exactly right, but I'll do my best to sort of see the large sweep. So I have about 5 questions that have to do with when do you see a time when people will not look at Asia as a monolith? And the follow-up to that was, so it's not just Asians, but it's Vietnamese or Koreans or Chinese or Tibetans. And what are the implications that you see in terms of taking this further in terms of the accuracy?
I mean, that's a impossibly hard question. What I can talk about is my experience of working on King and I. Inevitably, the cast always divides into ethnic groups, meaning the Koreans and the Filipino and they all end up in different groups, and there is a completely different kind of qualities to them. So it becomes impossible to think of it monolithically. So I don't, I don't know how the work addresses that question. That's a very different thing. The experience of working with people always brings out different things, but the work, it's very hard. I don't know how the work actually handles.
So, I mean, where it comes to casting, because I grew up came of age artistically in sort of an Asian American context, I tend to think, well, Meryl Streep can play all sorts of different kinds of European or white characters. So an Asian actor in America should be able to play various ethnicities. I think that is, I generally still believe that's true, although I also feel there are instances in which it's more useful to cast from a specific Asian ethnicity where the material calls for that and where there's particular sort of skills or perspectives that are that are being called for. In terms of the writing, I think if you look at contemporary Asian American playwrights, people do tend to write from specific ethnic communities. So people write characters who are Korean American or Vietnamese American or Chinese American, whatever. You very rarely see an Asian American play where the character is just called Asian.
Yeah, no. Yeah. But if I'm doing a classical show, it's the same thing can happen if you're doing Shakespeare. You should not be observing any sense of like color, race, even gender. You can mix all of them in, but if you get to a very, very specific writer who's writing for a specific community with specific requirements, then you have to observe those. So those rules shift all the time, and there are always a lot of differences. Or if I'm casting King and I, yes, we could, I suppose, do the whole thing with only Thai actors, or knowing how it is in New York with opportunities for Asian American actors, we cast everybody we possibly can among an incredibly talented group of people. So it's complicated, but.
So I have a question here about the Hamilton effect. And what does appropriation mean? What is the difference between representation and appropriation and diversity when you're making these decisions in terms of casting? That you're, sometimes overtly making that and sometimes saying that it is color, blind casting.
I mean, I think there's the distinction between sort of color-blind casting and what we are now calling color-conscious casting. So color-blind suggests, oh, well, everybody should be able to play anything, which then tends to get sort of twisted into, well, then, white actors should be able to play August Wilson. And as opposed to color-conscious, which is what I think you were just addressing, which is to look at the piece and what are the requirements of this work and how do I cast it in a way that that is most useful to the piece. And then also that if you're making choices to cast actors of color, say, in roles that are traditionally white roles, in general, that's a good thing. But then there can be situations where, it makes another meaning that you weren't intending. And to be conscious of that seems to me to be at the heart of color-conscious casting.
Yeah, and those rules are always a little bit up in the air. So having just done My Fair Lady is basically color-conscious casting. So, an amazing kid was cast to play Freddie Einsford Hill, who's sort of the love interest and there's a Mrs. Einsford Hill, and because I cast this kid who was African-American, I decided, well, Mrs. Einsford Hill should be African-American too. So I made a kind of family grouping within the show itself, but that's just color-conscious casting, as opposed to just pretending it didn't matter in every case, which you sometimes can do and you can't always do. But to try every chance you have to make interesting and more complicated choices.
So this is an interesting pairing of questions. David, you said that you prefer asking questions to making statements. Could you say a little bit more about that? And I'll leave it with that one first, and then I'll come back to some soft power.
I mean, generally when I start to write a play, it's because there's a question that I don't know how to answer. And I write the play to figure out what I understand about this that I may not know that I know. So in M. Butterfly, there's the sort of obvious question, well, how could the diplomat not have known, the gender of his lover? And in soft power actually began with the question, China desires soft power. There is a sort of conscious effort to, among other things, soft power, for those of you who don't know, this is Asia Society, probably most of you know the term, but it's a nation's strength that is intellectual or cultural as opposed to financial or military. So I think right now Britain is an example of a country with a huge amount of soft power, well, maybe not so much these days, but relative to its military strength or its economy. We still all watch The Crown. And so China really wants to achieve soft power and wants to create movies that are international box office successes and shows that end up on our Broadway, and has really not been very successful at it, to the point where South Korea is a more sort of powerful international pop culture engine than China. So my question was, is China's goal of achieving soft power inherently at odds with the sort of autocratic, top-down, content restriction method of its culture industry? And so, that's a question. So all of my plays begin with a question.
So there are a series of questions about soft power, and a number of them are wondering if in 50 years they're looking back and they're questioning. They're wondering about the questionable, and then another question having to do with the authenticity of those voices. Thinking about that and just projecting 50 years. So sort of combined with that, is there anything that has already surprised you about responses to soft power? But is there anything as you project and think, what is it going to be like 50 years from now?
Yeah, I mean, the sort of 50 years in the future conceit is not, I wouldn't say it's possible for me to be authentic about that, because obviously it's all speculation. And that allows for a great deal of imaginative freedom, which is fun and useful. And, in terms of, well, so what are people going to think of the work 50 years from now? I really hope people are aware of the work 50 years from now. And then, they will make their judgment on it the same way that we make our judgment on everything that's come before us. And I have no control over that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess just thinking, what if Verdi had set one of his operas in 1979, as opposed to 1879, when they're always contemporary? You don't have a lot of examples of people who from that era putting things that far in the future.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that we just did a revival a stage adaptation 2 or 3 years ago of 1984, and we're also like, yeah, that was 1984.
On the nose, pretty much. Yeah.
So this question has started with talking about Crazy Rich Asians and the fact that came out and didn't lump Asian Americans with Asians raised in countries outside of the U.S. And do you feel that soft power allows for those distinctions to come out naturally?
So wait, the question is that Crazy Rich Asians didn't lump Asians with Asian Americans, or did?
It didn't.
It did not. Okay, so it made the distinction.
Yes.
So I think so, in the sense that soft power has a kind of Asian American figure, the Asian American figure of DHH, who then gets interpreted in the musical by some, theoretically future Chinese American or Chinese national writers. And I think there is a kind of attempt to interrogate the Asian American perspective from the Chinese national perspective and vice versa.
Actually, can I just ask a question? Because I'm not done yet. Actually, I was thinking a lot about the Rodgers and Hammerstein and the 50-year or 100-year kind of proleptic move that you make. And one of the things that is interesting, I think, for me about something like The King and I is, I think, projecting backwards to think like part of what makes me concerned about it is to think about a time when people were seeing that in the 50s or whatever, and that was their only access to information about Thailand or whatever. Whereas I watched The King and I went home and Wikipedia'd, like The King of Siam or whatever. And so we have a different access to information. And so I think I'm curious about is part of the move of setting the soft power, the musical part in the future, is it about imagining a time when that is all we knew about
America?
The prominent American political figure, or like?
Yeah, I mean, I think...
Is it about historical ignorance, I guess?
Yeah, that, whatever, history gets written by the victors, or, and that so when we talk about things like appropriation, people, sort of white Americans sometimes go, oh, well, I don't really mind when Japanese people dress up in cowboy outfits. And I think that you have to understand appropriation within the context of a larger power structure, and how punching up is one sort of action and punching down is another. So, punching down, which is the distinction between, the peasant can make fun of the king, and that seems kind of cool. But if the king is making fun of the peasant, that just seems icky. And so similarly, I felt like in order to kind of understand appropriation, you had to create the conceit that that American culture was being appropriated by another culture which at that point in the future was the dominant culture. And the only culture right now that Americans are afraid of is China.
Yeah, I guess that's true.
I mean, I love how it turns everything on its head. So, because we always had this sort of very strict thing, but this puts everything upside down. So the revival in 25 years will be no doubt very fascinating. But at the same time, now it's like, this is where theater, great, really interesting creative theater artists are going to these places of manipulating time and putting us in these different contexts and then placing song in the middle of it, and that's really fun and really, I think, fascinating. I think it would have made Oscar Hammerstein, who I revere as a genius of all geniuses, he would have been like, wow, that's cool. I wouldn't have thought we could do that.
Do you worry about questions of appropriation when you're staging things? I mean, did you feel like, oh, I can't go there, or I have to not step on this toe, or?
I mean, I think you always have to be very, you have to ask hard questions all the time about what is going on. So, for example, in King and I, which, you have this ballet in the middle, and what we did, we found this book that Jerome Robbins used to make the dance, which was this amazing, very dense book about Asian dance. And there's a lot of opportunities. Should we redo it as a completely Thai dance? But that would have been not actually consistent with the music, which isn't written in that kind of instrumentation. Should we look at what he was investigating and do? It was a lot of complicated questions about that. So yes, I think as long as you're consistently honest about asking the questions very precisely, you try to get to... Another good example is Othello. I've done Othello at the Met, right? Well, Othello's famously a really hard part. And when it came to the character of Othello, we did not put him in any kind of makeup. We just, because there are very few people who can sing it at all in the world, and none of them happen to be African American or like that. So we just took it away, because that particular form of representation is not acceptable. So it's not there. The audience has to assign their own information to it.
Sorry, I didn't mean to bogart.
Oh, no, that was great. And actually, I was just going to ask you about Jerome Robbins, so I'm glad you preempted that. Because that idea that what are you being true to? Are you being true to an original conception? Are you, and what are the layers? And I think that's what's so exciting about this conversation, is that there are layers of interpretation that are very much alive and dynamic. And what heartens me is that the conversation is alive, and as you said, David, we're continuing to question, and that's probably the most important thing. I just want to thank these incredible artists and for all that they've done tonight. Thank you so much. This has been terrific. And I hope you'll come to see the next program that we have in the Asian American series that will be at Barnard and other programs that we have here at the Asia Society. And thank you all very much for coming tonight.
Happy New Year.